Good afternoon. You are watching Xavier University's special telecast on peace and development in Mindanao. This program is one of Xavier's efforts to provide an avenue for public dialogue and engagement on issues affecting Mindanao and the country. Recently, news of violence in Mindanao shocked the nation and the world. The gruesome massacre of 57 people, 30 of them journalists, in Maguindanao has been dubbed as the worst election-related massacre in Philippine history. This was followed by reports of hostage-taking in Agusan del Sur and the jailbreak in Basilan. I'm Father Jet Villarin, and tonight we'll be talking about perspectives on peace and development in Mindanao and how our collective spirit can address this issue. To better understand the conflict in Mindanao and help us respond to this challenge, we are featuring this evening a lineup of eminent scholars and friends to share with us their perspectives on today's topic. We'll talk with Professor Rudy Rudil, a noted historian and expert on Mindanao history, particularly on Moro and Lumad affairs. We'll talk to him for his perspective on the tribe people and culture. Welcome. Welcome to the show, Professor Rudil.
Mayong hapon, Father. Mayong hapon po sa tanan.
We also have with us tonight Father Pedro Walpole, the Executive Director of the Asia Forest Network and the Apu Palangguan Cultural Education Center, who will give us his perspective coming from the Lumad context. Welcome, Father Pedro.
Thank you for inviting us here.
And finally, to give us the Muslim perspective, Ms. Rowena Aulia Javier Alonto, the chairperson of the Muslim Women's Center for Change, joins us this afternoon. Welcome po, Ms. Alonto.
Thank you po. Good afternoon. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, to be able to share our ideas so that we could work together to bring about peace and development here in Mindanao.
Okay, salamat po. So, let me start our conversation, and I hope this becomes a meaningful exchange, no, of insight and ideas. What are your thoughts about this massacre, no, this grave act of violence that has been recently experienced, no, and other similar acts in Mindanao? I'd like to start perhaps with Ms. Alonto, kung meron po kayong sabihin.
Yes. The infamy that took place in Ampatuan, Maguindanao this year has exposed to the whole world the state of human insecurity which the Bangsamoro people have long been suffering from. The 31 media people who were among the victims of those murdered by state security forces turned into private armies by a political warlord who are clothed with impunity by the sitting regime, opens the window for all of us to see what kind of system exists in the Bangsamoro homeland which has caused this tragedy. Were it not for these dead journalists, if all the victims were Moros, then maybe it would not even have landed in the front pages of the newspapers. Just like the other crimes committed by these local political warlords, this mass murder would just have been relegated to the dustbin of history. Really, this tragedy has opened to the whole world what life is especially in the Bangsamoro homeland.
So, in a way, this tragedy has opened a lot, you know,
Yes.
has brought the truth
Yes.
to the surface. Any comments from our other guests? Professor?
Well, from my end, this is the first time that I'm being asked to think about it. Sa totoo lang, no? At the time that it happened and for the next few days, I was not thinking at all. Now, it was very difficult for me to react. For one thing, I'm from Maguindanao. So anyway, now that I'm being asked to think about it, these are some of the thoughts that I have in mind. For one thing, that portion, the Moro portion of Mindanao, has been the scene of so many conflicts, and although I'm shocked and feel saddened by this event, I certainly feel, I think I do feel that I have been going through a period of maybe rethinking, sadness, combined with research, objective reporting, and so on. Because I've been studying the Mindanao situation since 1973, and I have documented, I think, more events speaking about the same thing, more or less. No? People dying. Like, how many MNLF died during the war? How many MILF died during the war? How many civilians died during the war? How many military people, GU, and so on and so forth. In other words, we are talking about Mindanao with the Moro struggle for self-determination, punctuated by this recent event, the Luman struggle for self-determination, and the CPP-NPA is very much active in the scene. So we actually have 3 political conflicts in Mindanao, not just one.
Yeah. Thank you. So it adds to the complexity of the situation. That, we have all these actors trying to work for self-determination in this island. Father Pedro, maybe you have something to say on the violence too?
It's a very gruesome event. I think people felt very threatened, even though they may be far from Maguindanao, when they learned what the gruesome story really was. No killing is acceptable under these terms, but how gruesome it was really shocking, because we never thought within Philippine society that we would ever go to such a horrendous extent to kill and to deface people. It's a question I often ask on another level with the so-called natural disasters we have. How many people have to die until society wakes up and is accountable? You still have, the burial of sometimes thousands of people in the Philippines with floods and landslides that we're not prepared to look at. Now, this is something of total human destruction. And it's of such a massive scale in a supposed time of peace and election. How is this really going to impact? Is there a response that can be made that will bring society to a stage where it says this should never happen again? And it reminds us also of just so many events. You mentioned a few as you spoke at the beginning in Agusan. There's another encounter in Valencia the last day or so. And there are encounters all around, but then don't get into the media because they're not big enough, they're not gruesome enough. So when are we going to take this to heart and to action? That's the struggle that we're faced with.
Well, that raises a point about institution that is powerful, the government. It seems to, not to take accountability for its actions, but it's still the government that has the resources. I was just wondering if you have something to say about the role or the place and responsibility of government in all this. We're looking at systemic things in a way. We're looking at structural things, and maybe that can help us find the solutions to some of these recurring problems. I'd like to throw this.
I read something. Yeah.
5, 4.
I'm glad you've mentioned this seemingly endless cycle of violence, the deaths that we have experienced and have experienced time and again. It just shows that the problem is larger than what we had originally thought, and there are systemic structural things here. We're looking at government, but government is just one institution, really. And so I'd like to divert, or at least align the discussion now towards structural things, the roots of the violence that we're seeing, and perhaps we can reflect on that. Mas maganda sana kung makita rin yung karanasan natin. So, kahit sino, pwede magsimula.
Ikaw na lang.
Isa lang.
It should be, it's a fact that what we have now is the Mindanao problem. It is the Mindanao problem. And what is that Mindanao problem? It is the Bangsamoro problem. And it is a political problem. Unless that problem can be resolved, then the cycle of violence will go on. So we have to solve that Bangsamoro problem. You see, for instance, there is these political warlords and all to be instruments. I mean, they have been created to fight against the. They have been used as instruments of repression against any Moro liberation movement. That's a fact, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, isa na yun, no? That's one systemic thing.
Yeah. And so it is very important for all of us to understand what is the root of this problem, of this Bangsamoro problem. If we cannot understand this, then the Filipino people will not understand why the Moros are still up against arms against the government. I mean, they could not understand that the Moros are fighting for the right to self-determination, because the root cause of this problem is colonialism.
Okay, thank you.
Colonialism which has been continued by the Philippine government. Let me, hindi naman. You don't have to call it neo-colonialism, but when I say colonialism that is continued by the Philippine government, one aspect of that is the land distribution system. At the arrival of the Americans, what they did was for the America and the Spaniards to come together, settle their own, come up to their own political settlement, and that was the Treaty of Paris, where everybody was ceded, including areas, territories which were not colonized by Spain. And that is where, that's one of the roots of the struggle of the Bangsamoro for self-determination. Their self-determination was taken away from them by a signature, or two signatures, that of the Spanish representative and the American representative. That was the Treaty of Paris. And I have to say also that even the independent Philippines was included in that session. We were supposed to be independent already. So on the whole, we had 3 states that were included in that session. Speaking of independent Philippines, Sultanate of Sulu, and Sultanate of Maguindanao, which were not colonized. I'm not even talking about Lanao yet, no? But we should include that in the picture. In other words, we can question, and we should question even in academe, the very transaction of the Treaty of Paris, whether it was legitimate or not. Because otherwise, if we consider it legitimate, then we should question also the legitimacy of our own Philippine independence on June 12, 1898. So, ganun. And then technically, since we all lost in the war against America, we became colonized, and that is how we became one colony. And then in 1946, we were given one independence for the Republic of the Philippines, including rather the Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Maguindanao and the Patapungan Pungkuranao. Technically, it has to be technical. There should have been at least 3 independence that was given back by the United States. But from the very start, they started with their premise that there were no states in the Philippines. And they stuck to that until 1946. Now, land distribution. The United States started by abolishing the communal system of ownership in the Philippines, including Moro land. Second, they passed laws institutionalizing not only the Regalian doctrine, but this torrent system, wherein individuals can now own lands. So no more communal. And then they declared certain areas of the Philippines as public lands. So we heard about Cagayan Valley, Mindoro, Palawan, Mindanao. These areas were declared as open to resettlement because they were public lands. So one can go there and get a piece of land free. You apply for it and you can have a title. Now, what's wrong with that? Under a colonial system, maybe you can say nothing is wrong with it. But what happened is that today, our indigenous peoples, the Bangsamoro and the Lumad in Mindanao, are saying that they still have lands which are left after the resettlement program, and they would like their own ancestral domain recognized and declared and accepted by law as ancestral domain. Now, there are 2 concepts of ancestral domain here. The case of the Lumad, it's tenurial in character, but in the case of the Bangsamoro, it's political in character. Precisely because they had these sultanates in the past, where they had political territory. So it's both tenurial and political. Tenurial for tribal lands and political for other lands which were encompassed within the sultanates. Now, so when they talk about right to self-determination, they're talking about government asserting their right, and for government to recognize these rights with clearly defined territories. Now, the problem now is this. The Muslims and the Lumad became minorities in their own lands because as a result of the resettlement program supported by government, started by the Americans, continued by the Philippine government, we were flooded, literally flooded with settlers. And that was how the locals were marginalized. Now, another item that should be considered here is the class character of the laws that were used to bring in the settlers. 16 hectares were allowed for settlers. This was increased to 24, reverted to 16 during the colonial period. But if you will look at the other end, the indigenous peoples were allowed nothing. There was no provision in the law in the first Public Land Act. This was revised in 1919. First time there was a provision for 10 hectares. And this was even reduced to 4 in 1936. So you will see that the law itself was not equal in application. That's why I call this series of public land laws a classic case of class legislation being imposed upon the people of Mindanao.
On land, no, I would just
Yes, this is just the land.
the
Now,
land issue.
you can go on to politics, and then that's where you have the.
Yeah, but before we go to the political system, I just wanted to ask Pedro's own experience working with the Lumas on this.
Well, what we're talking about here is a 100-year period.
Yeah.
Yeah? And I suppose in the last 20 years, with the 87 Constitution, we began to recognize on paper indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
10 years after that, or 10 years ago, we established a model of tenure which is not necessarily applicable throughout the country. And the realization of that is very poor. And communities, their condition and their life and their security has been little improved by this process. And there's still so much bureaucracy that actually rights of access and of ownership are not genuinely with the majority of indigenous peoples in the country. And there's so many other things that block them. So it goes back to what we were saying, how public lands were decided and mismanaged for the last 100 years. On top of that, because of the marginalization that this has created, we have now a high level of poverty in all of these areas. Yeah? Our poorest provinces in the country are basically the Muslim communities because they have been marginalized in a political dynamic from the center. After that, it's basically where you have dominant indigenous communities. And they're even marginalized in many cases in Mindanao at the back end of a barangay.
I was just wondering, is there a growing marginalization, or are we at a standstill, or?
It's being re-entrenched. You
people
watch tuberculosis
Mhm.
is growing, so it's not at a standstill. The poor have even less area rurally than they've had before. But it's still the same poor because they retract and retract. Or else they come in on the bottom of society without any identity or recognition. But they are not able to access the basic services of a society by which they can engage with equity and with security and basic access. And this applies to millions of people in the Philippines that we visually don't have any connection with. It should be really the role of local government, and in this case the recent massacre shows that sometimes where the problem comes from. National government cannot address local need. It's incapable of. Yeah? It's really a very centralist system. And so the local government code of 92 was of great help. But at this stage, even that is weakening because governance as a process is weakening.
We talked about land, no? Pero pwede bang pag-usapan rin yung politika? The way we choose our leaders, because leadership seems to be an important part of the equation here, at least in forging peace and development. Any insights, any ideas on the political system naman? Because it is a political problem, as Ms. Alonto mentioned.
Yes, it's a political problem. That is why, for instance, the Bangsamoro people could not really elect their, they could not have they could not have leaders who could represent them because until now there is still this anti-colonial struggle. What we have now as the Bangsamoro problem is the current chapter of the anti-colonial struggle. So, take the example of the Abatuan. They are the leaders of the army, but are they do they represent the people of that place? I mean, the massacre says it all. What kind of system the national government has imposed on the Bangsamoro people. And so we really have to go back to the roots of the problem, and the roots is injustice. If we want to solve the problem, we have to see the real picture of how this thing happened. Just like what Professor Rodil said, the first injustice came when during the illegal sale during that time when the Bangsamoro was divested of their the Bangsamoro people were divested of their homeland, freedom and identity during the illegal sale and purchase of the Philippines during the Treaty of Paris, because Spain had no right to sell Mindanao as part of the Philippines. Second injustice came when the Americans when the Americans arbitrarily incorporated the Mindanao and Sulu to the Philippine Republic when they gave the independence. The Bangsamoro people did not want to be incorporated, right, Professor? And now another injustice is they are still not given their right to self-determination. So the struggle continues.
Professor, any response?
Well, what has happened in Mindanao really is something like this. At the coming of the Americans, since they already bought us from Spain, so they called us up as part of their insular possessions, and then they decided on what to do with the land. On the political end, what they did was to categorize the people into two broad categories, Christians and non-Christians. The Christians, we know them, but the non-Christians were the Moros and the wild tribes. Now, the political structures that they created in Mindanao were of two kinds, regular and special. For the Christian-dominated areas of Surigao and Misamis, they created the two regular provinces of Surigao and Misamis. For Agusan and Bukidnon, they created the special province of Agusan. This is for the Lumad. And for the rest of Mindanao, that included Davao, Cotabato, Lanao, Zamboanga, and Sulu, 5 provincial districts, they called it the special province called the Moro province. Why these areas? For the simple reason that these happen to be encompassed within the two sultanates of Sulu, Maguindanao, and the Patapungan Pungkoranao. So these were political territories incorporated, initially reflected in the political structures created by the Americans. Now, how did they utilize the local leaders? What in the Moro province, they of course had American administrators, governors, they call them. But in the local areas, the Datu system continued to exist. And even below that, there were tribal wards, including the Lumad areas. Tribal wards, in order to slowly absorb the leaders into the colonial system. What I mean by that really is that they were recognized as leaders, but they were also given special tasks for the colonial government. That is to ensure that taxes were properly collected and labor was properly organized for the purposes of the government, like building roads, for example. Now, in case there were resistance, it was the job of these leaders, whether they were Datus or Timboy or whatever, it was their task to report to the colonial government and to ensure that colonial government is able to suppress these acts of resistance. And then eventually this system was institutionalized. So if we move forward fast, we come down to the Philippine government, 1946. These datus became the senators, the governors, the congressmen. There was never any restructuring on the part of the Philippine government to revise the whole system in a manner that would be suitable to the tradition, for example, of the Sultanates. There was no such adjustment.
What manner would you consider to be suitable to the traditions?
Well, for example, what kind of election system do we have? We elect our leaders on the basis of one person, one vote. No? Now, but what is the tradition among the Muslims, for example, among the Lugan? They choose their leaders by consensus. Or they have, I don't know what other system, I don't want to discuss what other system they have. But they certainly have systems other than one person, one vote, which is reflective of what we now call democracy. Now this system operates in the minds, in the consciousness of these people. Tradition has been so deep among them that they cannot, what they see is what operates out of them is this system. And they kind of, they kind of implement the election code very artificially. In other words, okay, fill up the ballots, but who made the decision? You know, that's what I mean. No? So, in other words, what we have done, what the Americans have done, and what we have continued to adopt is, you know, to use an artificial system of choosing leaders. As we can see, it doesn't really work. And it will not, what happens? You know, if you comply with the election code, what you will have is traditional leaders competing with one another in an election system where you need a private army, where you need so much money, and so on and so forth. In other words, we have a system which is breeding its own monsters.
That was what we saw.
Yeah.
So that's just one example.
It's separated in a sense. The person who gets elected is the person who can deliver to the national.
Yeah.
Okay? So their accountability and their, if you like, position is to the above and not to the people below. So the traditional relationships, yeah, are not necessarily of a datu and not necessarily sustained. And they arise above that, and it's through this physical power that they're able to maintain their power.
Cut, time out. Climate change time, please.
Time
Everyone,
out,
please.
aircon please. Very hot, very good. Very hot.
Pinaganahan na sa akin.
Yeah, we get water for the crew after.
Okay.
And then aircon muna, aircon sandali. Time out. Hindi tayo sunlight. Masyadong mainit.
Bukas.
Kami na ba?
Pasimula pa lang.
Itoy.
Sumukan din. Higay ang pangalan. Ang anak niyo.
The traditional family violence, yeah, but we've had a lot of, in the past, vigilante violence. Is that going to come back? We have the NCAs, we have the capsules, yeah, all of this, and this is also disturbing, like the Eastern is okay, nobody's actually trying to stop it. So it is a problem.
Sir, yung
Tapos, paano ko mag-get? Gusto lang pakita na ba?
nagpipilian.
Okay na, guys. Audio, okay na.
Okay, aircon please.
Climate change.
Roll. Okay, 5. Okay, 5, 4,
Okay, so we've talked about land and the political
Excuse me,
system.
sir. 5, 4, 3.
So we've talked about the cycle of violence and we've reflected on the roots of the problem itself. We've looked at land, the political system. Now I'd like to throw this to our guests. Opportunities for peace. It's not really that recognized at times. There are initiatives and there have been efforts to build peace in Mindanao. So, from your own experience, do you know of or have you been involved in some of these initiatives? And anyone can begin.
Maybe. Yeah.
Sige, Rudy.
Well, I said earlier that I've been doing this thing, researching writing since 1973. And over a period of more than 35 years, I have realized that the problem itself is a process. And the solution should also come as not just one process, but several processes happening at the same time. I do see two major processes though. One is the need for negotiating panels to resolve political movements like the Bangsamoro. So you need a government panel and an MILF panel at the moment to resolve political issues. Another one is the people-to-people dialogues. Now, why people-to-people? Because I have noticed a very abnormal level of prejudices among the people. Their dislike for each other, lack of trust for one another. And each time there's a big conflict, this is enhanced many times more. And then we have more problems to resolve. Now, in the people-to-people, there are so many groups involved. Like, you have the Bishops' Ulama Conference. They are engaged in interfaith dialogues. We have peace zones in Cotabato. I have counted approximately more than 50 peace zones in Cotabato, Lanao del Sur, and Maguindanao alone. And what they have done is to decide among themselves what kind of peace they want. And then they negotiate with armed groups, whether this be MILF, AFP, or PNP. And they make sure that the civil officials are aware of what they're doing. And so far they have succeeded, which is a very good indication that we don't really have to wait for government to arrive at political settlement, even with the MILF or with the NDF. The people can, take their own lives in their hands, meaning to say that if they want to have peace, they have to define it themselves and tell the government forces to respect that. And it has happened already. So now, one very important element which has not been done by government, but which can probably be initiated by private schools, is the insertion of peace education in the curriculum. So far, there's only the MSU system that teaches Moro, Luma, and history in one 3-unit course. And then there's NDU that has peace education. I heard about a consortium between NDU, Ateneo de Zamboanga, Ateneo de Davao, and Xavier, and MSU Marawi. But I'm not sure if it's still there. I've not heard anything about it for some time. The most powerful, I think, is the educational system. Looking at, let's say, peace within 20 years, then we should work on the youth even as early as this time. In other words, project our effort for the next 20 years. By the end of 20 years, we'll have adults who are properly oriented on the history of Mindanao, the conflicts in Mindanao, and how to bring peace in Mindanao. One aspect of this peace education, I think, which is very necessary in conflict-affected areas, is trauma healing, especially among the victims of war. If we have a generation of traumatized people, it's very difficult to build peace or sustain peace later on, because we will have all kinds of internal problems among the population.
Thank you, Professor Rodil. I'd like to ask, well, Pedro here perhaps, because he runs a school also among the Lumad. Although you start them early.
We've got a whole range of problems in Mindanao. We're focusing particularly in terms of the Moro context. I work actually in Mindanao, in Maguindanao, with several communities there, working to put in water systems. Because my understanding is that unless we basically treat people with respect, with dignity and the basic needs that are there, we're not going to advance any. And I find that in these communities that are both Lumad and in other cases Muslim, I'm more than welcome. I feel safe with the MILF if it's in their area. They're very respectful and careful, and they appreciate it, and they're basically just trying to improve conditions of communities, particularly in terms of the women and their access to water, which is fundamental in the culture. On the other hand, we're dealing with situations where you have armed groups in the mountains, and the people are often caught between the armed forces of the Philippines and other armed groups, and it's very difficult there to set up peace zones. So it's a very different dynamic in Bukidnon, Agusan, Surigao and around, to have a community to have the independence and the integrity. Because most people get compromised. They get manipulated by one side or the other, and then when the other side is dominant in that area, they get pressured, and then they get interviewed by somebody else, and they can be liquidated, and none of this gets into the newspapers. I think it was just over 1 year period we were monitoring the situation when I was doing forest management in Agusan, and 30 people within that period had been killed in relation to resource extraction through armed differences. Now, where I have the hope is with the youth. As you said, I'm responsible for a school in the mountains. It's an indigenous community, open to migrants as well. But we work through the mother tongue, we work through the language and the concepts of ga'ob, which came long before ancestral domain. They are the real relationship with the land that we're trying to get local government to appreciate. This is the basis of education and of relation and of equity. So working with that now, the youth themselves, when there was a case of illegal logging in the area, the youth actually went out and negotiated with the group and said, why are you taking our resources? Yeah. Who are you actually fighting for? Is it the poor or the economy? Because this is our inheritance. And they had the integrity and, if you like, the naivete in which there is a wisdom to actually challenge openly. The same with mining companies. This is not a time to do mining exploration in Mindanao, because it inevitably gets hooked up with violence and with arms. And again, minorities get manipulated. So resource exploitation is very damaging in the moment. I'm living in a valley which really is not the grand plateau of the economy of Bukidnon, but more akin to Agusan, where there are 54 mineral exploration applications. This is highly destructive of a people and of their rights and of their land. We've seen the destruction of many of the communities of northern Surigao, the Mamanwa. The money is highly destructive in the same way arms are destructive. So Mindanao is still a resource to be exploited by the rest of the country. So for me, this is bottom line across: integrity, appropriate economy. We're seeing roads built that nobody asked to be built. Who's exploiting what along these roads? There's certainly a new road, which is 20, 30 miles from a parallel road that goes across. So we really feel we're being used. So the only power we have is to whatever group comes up, we say, sorry, if you want to come into the village, we have 150 children here gathered from the neighboring villages. Please leave your arms and come in, and you can see everything. But then take your arms on the way out. But don't bring your arms in, because you attract
So
conflict.
that's happening. That's a peace zone. in
That's
a way.
happening. I mean, we had the killings at the beginning of the year in Zamboanguita, which involved youth, of no ideological coherence, but there are no jobs. There's no basic economy that sustains people. And all we want to do is plant tropa or plant large scale, but we're not planting with people. And we're not planning an economy that's appropriate to the culture and the times. It's an exploitive one that will increase productivity on a national level maybe, but not for people in Mindanao. So I think we have to rework our economy and in what the priorities are in Mindanao by people in Mindanao. And our strength and our efforts has to be in an open education. I have been asking Xavier University to send its teachers to Marawi. Everybody goes to Marawi, Iligan, Cotabato, and actually listen to how teachers there deal with it. One of our biggest problems is actually to get the youth to talk about the problem they have, the fear they have. We gathered about 200 youth the other month in Bendum after the killings, just for them to air out their concerns. And what is their role in this?
Well,
Because everybody's rushing around doing everything, but it's being that is important. And for the Lumad, it is very important to give spiritual space. It's the same for Christian and it's the same for Muslim. Not religion, just spiritual space. And an ability to understand how in a society we overcome these injustices.
Okay,
So
thank
that's
you.
where I place the hope, along with delivery of basic services.
Okay, thank you. Since we've been talking about the young, I'd like to ask Ms. Alonto about, I'm probably there are some young people here watching now. What do you think would be, if I were a young person, what can he or she do for peace? And perhaps you can also assume the Muslim perspective here among the young people.
Okay, excuse me, cut muna.
Yes, sorry.
Cut muna.
Aircon